This is Duke University.
So let me invite Mark Anthony Neal to join us from Duke's Department of African and African American Studies to respond to the papers, and then we're going to open up to the floor.
Yeah, let me start with Zaheer. First, because the shit was fire. And I'm glad you mentioned the Ferguson piece. You know, Farrakhan met with these Ferguson protesters, had him at his house, and it struck me as significant because, you know, the Nation of Islam, as you mentioned, comes in where there's this gap. And, you know, Farrakhan now has the benefit of seeing a long arc of this. I know he dealt with very pointed criticisms at that gathering around gender, you know, that he's probably never had to hear, you know, up close and personal before. And you wonder where that goes forward. Also, when you mention the presence of the Nation of Islam, Fruit of Islam in terms of communities, those who were friends of The Wire, right? That was the subtle little hint of that in The Wire with Brother Mouzone. Right? If you were trying to figure out who Brother Mouzone was and how he functioned so comfortably, right, you know, in the towers, in The Wire, right, it's about this reference of FOI and the role that they played, you know, in black communities. I think Bill's piece is so critical about the oral history piece, right? We talked about, you know, a few weeks ago, One Night in Miami, which opened in Baltimore and ran for 10 days, and it's a play that's about, by Kemp Powers, that's about the last night, or the night after Ali wins the heavyweight fight. And some of this was well known, a lot of it isn't. But, you know, when you see the footage of Malcolm X, when you see the footage of Ali at the end of the fight, of course, he invites Sam Cooke into the ring, right? You know, all these folks around him is like, that's my friend Sam Cooke, that's my friend. And Sam comes in, says a few words. Immediately they go not to the white hotels in Miami, but they go to the black hotel in Miami Beach. And it's just Malcolm, who has been with Ali for 6 weeks with his family, Sam Cooke, Jim Brown, because the four of them are actually running partners for a 9-month period here. It is very shortly before Ali comes out and announces himself as Muhammad Ali, right? Though that had effectively occurred already, right? But they wanted him to be heavyweight champion when he could carry a kind of social capital of making that public, and we all want to have been in that room, right? That's the oral history that we wish. And it does get to this issue that Zaheer talks about, the difference between history, right? We weren't in that room, but our memories of who these men were and imagining, as Kemp Powers does in this play, what those conversations would have been. Malcolm's 39 years old, right? He's the oldest person in the room. He's a political strategist. Sam Cooke is 33. We don't think about him in very political kind of ways, but he was also making very distinct political moves in terms of his business practices, right, that would have dramatic impact. We don't often do the mathematics of the calendar to connect their deaths, right? Sam Cooke is killed under suspicious circumstances in December of '64. Malcolm X is killed in February of '65. And when I first, you know, as a teenager, right, and going to college, when I first heard those two things, you know, first finding out that Sam Cooke had a copy of Muhammad Speaks in the passenger seat of his still running yellow Ferrari or red Ferrari. And I would have never thought of Sam Cooke as even being anywhere close next to the Nation of Islam, right? But this was, in fact, the case. And, of course, these cats are older, right? They need younger guys on the ground. You know, Jim Brown, who was at the peak of his athletic career at this point in time, he and Ali had been running partners because they were young athletes. And so they spent a lot of time together in that regard. And, of course, Ali, who Malcolm X recognizes very, very young, as Cassius Clay. You know, and the thing that we forget about Ali when we think about him now, because we think about him as this great statesperson, if you will, for black political engagement. But, you know, if you think about how even black folks thought about Cassius Clay around 1960, you know, he might be a step below Lil Wayne. And you know, he was thought of as a court gesture, right? He was thought of no one to be taken seriously. And Malcolm understood very early that there was something else going on, right? And his first inroad to Muhammad Ali is, you know, let's have some of these Nation of Islam cooks come in and start for you to have a better diet, right? So you could have some longevity with your career And that's where that relationship starts. And it always makes me wonder, what have been the power of those four figures being able to mature going forward, right? And then we could start bringing folks in the room like a Nina Simone. We could start bringing folks in the room like a young Aretha Franklin, who we forget, right, is in a household with Reverend C.L. Franklin, right, who was close confidant, with Martin Luther King. That relationship actually could have created the context for that kind of bridge between the more liberal wing of the black political agenda and the more radical wing of the black political agenda, right? So when you talk about oral history, right, and that's something that's lost now, right? Who's going to sit down with Jim Brown to extract these narratives, right? Who can sit down with Muhammad Ali to extract these narratives to talk about the significance of that particular relationship at that period of time? So we can open this up to the audience. That's great.
So we're happy to open it up to the floor. There's a mic that's coming around, and until we have a chance to hear you, until we're waiting for Carrie to get there, one of the passages from Dr. Marable's book that just breaks your heart is that every single person that Malcolm ever trusted betrayed him at some point. And if that doesn't get to you, including his own relationship with the Honorable Elijah Muhammad, including his bodyguard, his driver, and also Muhammad Ali, the rift that they had, which Muhammad Ali later on calls the biggest regret of his life. I think for all of us, we're thinking about how somebody has to love you in order for you to become who you are, and that the very same people that have loved you may end up betraying you. I think there's a lot of wisdom in that. There's a question back there. And please identify if it's to the panel as a whole or one particular speaker.
Okay, this question, I guess, is more for Zaheer. I was wondering if you thought that, or if you found in your research, the distortions of memory of Malcolm X and the whole civil rights movement in the late 80s, early 90s, was that kind of due to the commodification of the legacy of Martin Luther King and Malcolm X? I know, there's some issues, of course, with Martin Luther King's, I guess, his estate being kind of really controlled by his children. I was just wondering if you can make some comments on that.
When you say the distortion of Malcolm,
or the different memories,
right? Well, I think the writing of Malcolm's history was motivated by the people's memory, right? I mean, there's the function of the autobiography, which, if you look at the obituaries written right after Malcolm's been killed, it's like, oh, he was a lowlife, he was a thief, he was a cocaine dealer, all this stuff. He was a tragic victim of the ghetto. And then by December, when his autobiography is released, it's like, wow, who knew, right? So I think the autobiography has helped to preserve a certain way of understanding Malcolm. But beyond that, I think, and this is why hip-hop is crucial in understanding how hip-hop artists and people in the hip-hop community, they were looking around at their social condition and were looking for a historical reference point to understand that condition, right? And Malcolm kind of spoke to that. The availability of his speeches spoke to that. I mean, there was a whole burgeoning industry. If you went to 125th Street in the late 80s or early 90s, it was just lined with vendors, and they were selling, books and tapes and pies and incense and newspapers, and this was the people's knowledge industry, right? And they led the vanguard, right? The historians were catching up, right? With King, it was a little bit different. Right? And so, I mean, that doesn't get into the accuracy of the representation, but it does say that the one thing about Malcolm is that I would argue it was the people who kept his legacy alive, right? When no one would touch him, right? He was not a respectable figure. Even Manning would tell us this story. He tells the story of riding the elevator with a, regarded faculty colleague of his who says to him, you know, what are you working on? He's like, I'm working on a biography of Malcolm X. And this person says to him, oh, maybe you'll find something good to say. Wow. And this is in the 2000s, right? But if you were riding that elevator in the Harlem State Office building, right, they'll say, you'd be hard-pressed to find something bad to say, right?
This is to all panel. How do you see the public intellectual work about Malcolm beyond the boundaries of academia? And how would you assess the public intellectual work in his legacy and work?
That's a great question. Mm-hmm. You know, one of the things that got me interested in digital technology and the digital humanities moment was just wondering what Malcolm X and Martin Luther King's relationship would have been if they would have had access to handheld cell phones. If they would have been able to text each other, right? Because it would not have necessitated the kind of phone call or physical gathering, you know, where you could imagine Malcolm just sending, you know, Martin Luther King a text. Yeah, I know you heard what I said on TV last night. Yeah, I called you a handkerchief head, right? But understand that, you know, there's a purpose behind that, right? And we see that play out, of course, in Ava DuVernay's Selma, right, where he's very conscious of, you know, the kind of impact he could have positively on the civil rights movement because he was who he was. That said, I think there's no question that he was someone who imagined himself as that kind of public figure. Both in terms of his oratory style. I mean, when you think about what he does in prison, where he transforms himself into a scholar. I think that's one of the breaks, as Zaheer would talk about, that we don't spend enough time talking about. You know, he had the time and he read everything. He increased his vocabulary. So when he comes out of prison, right, he clearly sees himself as a public figure. You know, this is someone who lectures at Oxford. You know, shortly before his death. I mean, he clearly saw himself in that public kind of way. And it always makes you wonder, you know, what he would have done. You know, when I'm critical of Twitter or Black Twitter, wondering what a Malcolm X would have done with the kind of digital media platforms that we have now, right? If he would have had access to Twitter or Facebook or Instagram, what he would have been able to do with that given his already natural public engagement.
This question for Zaheer. Love the presentation, brother. I think you're spot on about the way in which Malcolm and reemerges within hip hop. And I guess I wanted to ask you, like, you know, are there examples? I mean, we could think about, like, you know, because I think you're right that there's this post-Meccan Malcolm that gets kind of emphasized and not the kind of NOI Malcolm. And in hip hop, you see that kind of brought back, particularly because of the presence of Farrakhan, right? And it kind of, you know, in many ways, you know, contains kind of Malcolm. The narrative kind of ends, and Spike's film even does it a certain way too. It kind of culminates in this kind of rehistoricization of Malcolm. But you still see iterations of a kind of post-Meccan Malcolm ideal. I mean, Gang Starr's Who's Gonna Take the Weight? You know, Rakim's Casualties of War. I mean, you see Tragedy Gaddafi and the reference to Libya. And I mean, you still hear those kind of moves being made. Now, of course, we know that even the NOI, when Malcolm was there, had the kind of internationalist frame as well. So I wonder if you can maybe talk about, are there any even interruptions in the way in which Malcolm was popularly memorialized that references or leaves a trace of that post-Meccan moment, right?
Well, I mean, I think so. Part of this is that in some ways, Farrakhan continues the work that Malcolm engaged in after he left the nation, right? Farrakhan goes to Mecca, but he comes back from Mecca with a very different argument, right? He comes back from Mecca articulating a critique of racism within the Muslim world and the role of elites, right? Which is something Malcolm does not comment on. I don't think slavery had been abolished yet when Malcolm went to Mecca. And there's this scene in the autobiography where he's sitting and a servant comes in, and it's just a passing thing. What did Malcolm see this, and what did he think of this, right? So there's that, and then of course, Farrakhan is engaged with the third world in ways that maybe the nation would not have been, right? he has been to Cuba so many times, right? I've seen so many pictures of, in fact, there's a picture of Farrakhan with an afro, right, in Cuba in the 70s before he rebuilds the nation after, like there's a period where he like withdraws and tries to go find himself, and he's in Cuba, right? And he's like, so he's the one engaging Gaddafi, right? He's engaging the anti-apartheid movement, right? So I think Manning would argue that the Million Man March in some ways fulfilled Malcolm's intention to build a united front where the Muslims would be at the vanguard. This is in one of the missing chapters of the autobiography of Malcolm X that did not make the publication. And so I think part of why it's so easy for the conflation of the two, again, is they're informing each other.
This is also for Zaheer, because you had touched on the relationship between Farrakhan and Malcolm in the 80s and 90s, and just so to kind of continue with that, if there were a Farrakhan mixtape, would you expect any kind of differences? I mean, considering the significant overlap between Farrakhan and Malcolm in hip-hop, would you expect to find different patterns or different people using Farrakhan in ways that Malcolm doesn't get used, or vice versa?
Well, I think this is off the top of my head, because I actually did another project chronicling the influence of Islam in hip-hop, which was a timeline. And just off the top of my head, I would say that the references to Farrakhan are much more tightly tied to him. Either his words or the references are you won't find the obscure, no one's going to call him a car or use one of his phrases to talk about buying expensive clothes. And part of that is because he's alive, right? So he's alive to be the caretaker of his legacy, right? In ways that Malcolm is not, right? And this is kind of like, there's no one alive to hold us responsible for when we say we like Malcolm, right? What happens if Malcolm calls a meeting? Will you go? Because a lot of the people who are like, I'm down with Malcolm now, were running from him when he was alive, right? And I wonder 20 years from now, how many people are going to be down with Farrakhan when they will only meet him, as he would say, like a prostitute meets you in the privacy of a hotel room, right? Because he's met a lot of people. You'd be so surprised the kind of regard that he has within the black community.
Stevie Wonder name check some of the songs of the Key of Life.
Yeah. And he just doesn't put people on blast because he respects whatever, right? But so I think you would find, though, because he's alive, people are afraid to say, like, I'm down with Farrakhan because he's alive. What if he says do something? You might be like, maybe not, right? So Malcolm is not alive to ask us to do anything.
Let me ask you a quick question, Zaheer, since we're on that hip-hop piece. What do you do with a figure like Jay Electronica?
Yeah. Well, yes, I wrote a piece last. So Jay Electronica is, so one of the things, and this might tie to Sohail's point, is that you see after the references of the Nation of Islam under Farrakhan and hip-hop peak around 95, around the Million Man March, right? And then certainly after 9/11, when there's a reassertion of Muslim identity on the part of, so the Nation of Islam was like very skilled in engaging like a public religion, right? And there, the Sunni Muslim community was not as publicly engaged. But after 9/11, you saw greater public engagement, and you see this reflected in like Mos Def and all these other artists that kind of to speak to that. So Jay Electronica though represents a revival, right? And how far he goes, we'll see. Everyone's waiting for the album that but he represents a really interesting revival. It'll see. I'm waiting to see what happens. But and I said this about, and this is the thing about Malcolm versus Farrakhan. It's easy to appropriate dead people in ways that you can't appropriate live people, right? And specifically, the Nation of Islam has a kind of black cool that is hard to appropriate. And I said this, Malcolm Moore with a bow tie is Malcolm Moore dressed for prom, right? A black man in a bow tie is brother whatever that was in that episode of Empire where Cookie went to see the rapper's mother, right? This is the same thing. So you see the legacy of the Nation of Islam. Like people may say, well, where's the nation today? Well, the nation is recorded in this culture and is going to keep appearing.
Right.
Hi, thanks. This question is for Professor Darity, although what I will say is a lot of the stuff that we have on Muhammad Ali is around, but nobody's looking at it. A lot of journalists do it. And the cutest thing about that post-fight moment is they had an ice cream party because Malcolm and Muhammad Ali weren't drinking. So
and that gets reflected in the play.
Yeah. So yeah, and unfortunately, a lot of the info that we do have is from our friends at the FBI. But anyway, the question is about the title of Professor Darity's piece, "And Black Men Willing to Resort to Violence," and tied to Sohail's work on what is the source of violence, and Malcolm X speaking out on that. And I was wondering about whether there is a separation, or how we think about Malcolm reiterating that you see in the Panthers that we are not bringing violence to society. We are trying to protect ourselves in a society that is based on violence, and you see that in Angela Davis's work as well. So how do you tie that, or how do you think about this stance of self-defense in relationship with what Nat Turner's doing, or what, I don't know, Fanon's talking about with the Algerian Revolution? So how do you link those two?
Well, I guess I have a tendency to think that self-defense is slightly different from liberation. Because self-defense is an act of protection within an oppressive context, but a liberation movement is designed to overthrow the oppressive context altogether. So I see Nat Turner as being engaged in the use of violence for liberation. And I think that's slightly different from taking the position that, well, we're going to use these means to protect ourselves from the assault that's being visited upon us, as opposed to trying to alter the context in which that assault is being imposed on us.
Mm-hmm. Hi there. Scholars in subaltern studies sort of have wrestled with this problem of representation, an ethical problem of representation, and they call it the problem of strategic essentialism. At the same time that you're critiquing a narrative, a kind of mythology and whatnot, and you're doing this as an academic enterprise, you're also laying down your own track. And at what point, and in how, and what space do you navigate that tension? You know, I think a lot of us praxis-oriented scholars deal with that. But if you want to invoke Malcolm at a moment of Ferguson, you can't do that in the same way that you would in a panel discussion at an elite university. So when do you decide, how do you decide when you lay down the track on representing Malcolm for a political and for a social purpose?
That was for me?
Anybody.
Oh.
Sorry, I was just looking at you, my bad.
Well, okay, so I'm in an academic context, so I can invoke Lacan, right? Like Lacan tells us that our ways of thinking about the world are constrained by the language that we use. Mm-hmm. But we have to use language to talk about being constrained by the language that we use. So I mean, I think that's similar to the kind of puzzle you're posing. I guess my inclination is to think about the use of tools of translation, mm-hmm. and to figure out in a thoroughly non-paternalistic way, how do you express the same set of ideas in a context in which people require or need a different language to hear them? And so my answer is I wouldn't deliver a different message to an academic audience from a non-academic audience, but the mode of presentation might be different.
And I would like to say that I think that in our oral history program, we focus on asking as specific questions as possible. We find out, we first of all encourage students to learn as much as they possibly can from the written record about what the episode is we're trying to talk about, and then we get down to very detailed questions that can then be verified by talking to other people or by going other places. So you basically get out of the role of talking in gigantic generalizations, and you get as detailed and precise as you possibly can. And that's a good way of protecting against what you're talking about.
Let me add something else. It's related to the oral history or the use of oral histories. I mentioned that Sharon Ewell Foster's novel of Nat Turner, I believe, is anchored heavily in the research that F. Roy Johnston did, which is in a volume called The Nat Turner Story. He has another one called The Nat Turner Slave Revolt, but it's not as interesting. And in the Nat Turner story, there's a couple of pieces of information that emerge from the oral histories that I haven't seen anywhere else. One is the intimation that Benjamin Turner, who owned Nat Turner and his mother, was Nat Turner's father. Okay, and that's somewhat consistent with his physical appearance that was reported in the wanted advertisements that were circulated. And then the second thing is that his mother, and this was very unusual, it was not from West Africa, but was supposedly Ethiopian. And so there's a set of facts, in quotes, that emerge from the oral histories that are inconsistent with what is typically told as the Nat Turner story, and that leads her to reframe the way in which we think about Nat Turner's life in the context of her novel.
This is for any panelist. With the climate that's happening with the teaching of history on the high school level, with a lot of legislators trying to decide what should be in the books, what should not be in the books, in terms of American exceptionalism, you're teaching the children how to hate America. How do any of you feel that Malcolm should be framed in a high school historical context?
I'm so glad you asked that question, and I really invite you to come tomorrow for that panel that we've got for the full 2 hours to have a thorough discussion of that. So, wonderful plant in the audience for plugging in our panel for tomorrow.
I do have a comment, which is independent of the pressures of censorship and regulation of what's being taught, I don't think the quality of what's being taught was that good in the first place. I had a group. We had a summer camp for kids who were in middle school and high school from the Durham public schools. These are very bright kids. They could not tell us when the Civil War took place. And then when they were shown a film of Lyndon Johnson talking and were asked who it was, the first response was Abraham Lincoln. So, I mean, apart from the question of teachers being restricted in what they can teach, they really aren't doing a great job right now.
I think you teach your autobiography in a high school setting as a coming-of-age narrative.
Yeah, yeah, yeah.
I just want to make a really quick comment. My daughters are in elementary school, and in second grade, they're learning about African American history and also the civil rights movement almost concurrently. And they brought home a little book. This was in Clay County, and it had Bill Cosby, Louis Armstrong, Martin Luther King,
Michael Jordan.
Malcolm X in the book. Which is kind of an interesting random selection.
Any women?
Rosa Parks didn't make
it. They talked about Rosa Parks in a second.
Right. In the interest of time, let me ask for two people to raise their questions, and then maybe the panelists can somehow merge the two together. So I think there was a question from May, and then the question up here from a gentleman.
Hi. I will try to make it really quickly. To everybody, especially since a lot of people have been invoking Ferguson, what was really interesting that came out of the Palestine delegation is when they were meeting with BDS activists, they realized they hated the term nonviolent. And they hated that they had to live up to this nonviolence moniker or expectation. So they started calling themselves militant. And I don't know if they've taken it on in public discourse, but I was wondering how you think they might be remembered, because remember when Malcolm dies, as you're saying, he gets the tag militant, and we were fighting so hard to give him more complexity. I thought that was interesting that they chose that as their language instead of radical.
Yeah.
Hi, thank you for your presentations. My question actually is quite similar in certain ways, but it has to do, I guess, with the question of representation as well as memory in terms of who accesses Malcolm. So what I'm thinking about is the manner in which certain phases of Malcolm's life, I guess if we think of it in terms of phases or breaks as you mentioned earlier, certain parts are de-emphasized. So for example, his Detroit Red phase. I believe there was a Robin Kelly article written a while back that thought about the way in which his persona as Detroit Red, wearing zoot suits, a life of criminality, violence, drug use, etc., could be thought of as a kind of a life of resistance to sort of a wartime thriftiness. And so I think about that in terms of who is allowed to sort of think about Malcolm and the way we access Malcolm in terms of thinking about the way in which Ferguson protesters were represented in media, and particularly how youth might access Malcolm, who don't fit a kind of a particular sort of respectability, I don't know.
Well, it's interesting because a lot of the post-2000 hip-hop references to Malcolm are more Detroit Red references. People like Big L and AZ, they are talking about Detroit Red. To your larger point, though, I think the discourse over respectability politics is really interesting, right? Because in some ways, Malcolm was seen as not, his politics were seen as not respectable. But Malcolm's conduct, his presentation, his style of presentation, the way he carried himself, the way he engaged people, could be considered quite conservative, right? And so I think it has to do, the question is, wherein does your radicalism lie? Is your radicalism in style? Or is your radicalism in politics and engagement? And I think when we have these discussions about respectability politics, we have to disengage those two words and ask the question, right? Is your is your radicalism because you decide to challenge the way people dress, you challenge an aesthetic of respectability, or you challenge the gender norms of respectability, or or you challenge, the accepted politics of respectability, and I think that adds for a more complex understanding of this. That Malcolm was like always dressed to the nines, right? And Malcolm spoke to people, and even the people with whom he disagreed. If you sat down, they would say, "Oh, he was so kind, he was so gentle, he was all," that could be respectability, right? But in his politics, is a different story.
Kind of in response to May's question, I think that part of the veneration we have for nonviolence is our association with its ostensible modern architect, Mahatma Gandhi. And I think one of the key things we have to do is demystify Mahatma Gandhi, okay, who was ultimately was a virulent caste Hindu and was entirely in favor of preserving the existence of a caste system that had people who were rendered untouchable. He just said we should be nicer to them, but he certainly didn't want to get rid of the system. And so I think that we need to begin to critique Mahatma Gandhi to begin to diffuse the power of nonviolence as a means of describing or promoting social movements.
I want to say just one thing about someone whose 100th birthday we're celebrating this entire year at Duke. This is John Hope Franklin. John Hope Franklin was someone of extraordinary strength who never, ever accepted second-class treatment, and who was forever angry at the United States Navy for refusing to accept him and his credentials as an expert historian during World War II. Every story I've ever heard from John Hope Franklin testified to what I have described as his quiet strength. He never, ever compromised but his strength was always one which was persistent and quiet. The other example I would use is Nelson Mandela. Mandela is praised by many people for the way in which he brought South Africa out of apartheid into a multiracial society. What we tend to forget is that Nelson Mandela was the head of the MK in the 1960s, which was the campaign of violence against apartheid. So I think we need to recognize that at different places and different times, different responses are called for.
Wow. It's good to have an academic discussion that doesn't put walls and borders and boundaries around it. It's poignant to be mindful of the age in which we live, where the nation state that we all pay our taxes to dropped so many bombs in Afghanistan that after 3 days, the commander said, we have no more targets to bomb. And our closest ally in the Middle East dropped a bomb on the city of Shujaia once every 7 seconds. When we've got more drones killing more civilians than died in 9/11, it's an extraordinary statement to ask black and brown people to treat themselves non-violently. So, I'd like to pause and thank you all, thank the speakers, and issue an invitation for you all to join us tomorrow, Saturday, on the actual 50th anniversary of Brother Malcolm's assassination. We hope to begin, inshallah, at 10 a.m. sharp. See, I didn't make a German joke. In the Global Education Center, Nelson Mandela Auditorium, in the Global FedEx Cha-Ching Auditorium over at UNC. All universities are corporations, where Professor Bill Hart, Professor Jamila Kareem, and soon-to-be Professor Michael Muhammad Knight are going to be presenting, and then we're going to have a teach-in tomorrow afternoon. Let me again thank you and ask you to join me in acknowledging the panelists.